The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 13th chapter. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. The Gospel of the Lord. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my spirit be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. We begin the season of Advent with the realization that it does not feel like any Advent we have ever experienced before. We begin the season of Advent knowing that we are in the midst of a pandemic and we aren't sure when it will be over. We begin the season of Advent unable to gather together with our church family or even our extended families to take part in beloved holiday traditions. We begin the season of Advent, our time of waiting, with the realization that we have already been waiting for far too long for all of this to change. The gospel this week seems to match our already gloomy moods. We have descriptions of suffering, of the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, stars falling from heaven, and the Son of Man descending from heaven in all of his rather terrifying glory. Generally, these seem like things we would try to avoid, like scenes out of the latest movie featuring the end of the world as we know it. They might even remind us of scenes we have experienced this year in our lives and on the news. Hospitals filled to capacity, schools forced to shut down, the sky turning orange in California from wildfires, shootings and protests and counter-protests bringing about chaos. None of us wanted this year to be like this, and Mark's description of the end of the world does not sound very appealing either. But in Mark's day, his readers might not have seen it that way. The author of the Gospel of Mark was writing to a church that was being persecuted, a church who longed to know that God was in control and that God, who was all-powerful, would come down from heaven in just this way in order to end their time of suffering and despair. When we begin to think of these words of Jesus as a message of hope to a persecuted people, we can think about their meaning differently. They no longer are words of terror, but instead are words of comfort that remind us that our God is the all-powerful creator of the world. Isaiah uses the same kind of imagery in the Old Testament reading for this week, too. I would never want to compare Christians in America today to the Christians in Mark's day who were persecuted for their faith. But it is easy to see how all people in America today, not just Christians, are tired of living with things the way they are. Perhaps we would also welcome the knowledge that in the midst of the chaos and stress and anxiety of our lives during these days, an all-powerful God is still in control. An all-powerful God is on the way. In Mark, when Jesus says that the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, I am reminded of a very routine event that happens every so often, an eclipse. There is nothing really that crazy about an eclipse. They do not mean that the end of the world is coming, even though some Christians like to use them to predict this, and even though they have been used as omens and signs for as long as there have been people on earth to experience them. But in themselves, they add or take away nothing from life on earth, and they are routine. They can be predicted. We know when they will occur. But yet they are at the same time miraculous, signs that a God who is more powerful and creative than we will ever be is in control. In a book called Miracles, author Eric Metaxas discusses at great length the idea that when we truly consider everything that had to go exactly right for there to be life on this planet, there is no way it could simply be an accident, but that life on earth, all life, not just human life, is in itself a miracle. He also explains how we are reminded of this through various aspects of our created world, including eclipses. He writes, most of us haven't considered that for eclipses to occur as they do, the sun and moon must appear almost precisely the same size in the sky. As with so many things, we take eclipses for granted. They are just a part of the way things are. But when we know the details of the sizes and numbers of the moons throughout our solar system, the idea that the sun and our moon appear almost exactly the same size from our earthbound vantage point is essentially preposterous and bizarre. But it is this freakish fact that makes them cover each other so perfectly during a total eclipse. Though it has no bearing on the existence of life as far as we know, it gives such startling evidence of design, and therefore a designer, that we can hardly ignore it. With this in mind, Jesus' words in Mark no longer sound like threats to our existence, but instead a reminder to a people in desperate need of hope, that God who created all things has control over all of creation, will redeem all of creation, and will make use of God's power over all of creation in order to bring about the abundant life that God promises for that very creation. The promise of abundant life from a God who dares to send God's own self into the midst of our very lives involves all of the cosmos. For it was to all of the cosmos that God came down and will come down to again, not just human beings or a certain race of human beings from a particular time or corner of the earth. This is also an acknowledgement that there is no possible way without God that we could make this promised abundant life happen. We could possibly bring about abundant life for some of creation for some of the time, but not for all of creation all of the time. Not only does bringing about abundant life involve a complete overhaul of everything that we as humans do, a complete turning around from our sinful ways, but it also involves God at work in the entire created world, the entire cosmos. As we are thinking about stewardship during this season, all of this leads us to a stewardship question. What does God call us to do in order to participate in God's plan for abundant life? If all of creation is involved in this plan, which I think Mark shows is true, then we must be involved too in some way. And that is what Jesus gets at in the second half of our gospel reading this morning. Even though the ultimate bringing about of abundant life for all of creation will be something that involves God exercising God's power over and within the created world in a way that we will not fully understand until it happens. In the meantime, in the waiting time, God did something else. God became present in our world not as the Son of Man coming in clouds, but as a person, a baby, a powerless infant born to a teenager and her carpenter fiancé. And because that powerless infant grew up, healed people, overturned tables along with the corrupt and systemically sinful ways of life in his world, changed lives, was crucified, died, and rose again, God as person continues to be present with us now in the form of the risen Christ, with us in the ordinary elements of bread and wine and water. The risen Christ is active and at work in our lives, calling us to prepare for this abundant life that will one day be a reality. No matter how far away that reality has seemed throughout everything we have experienced this year. Jesus says, "It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come." We are here in the midst of this world, in the midst of what some theologians would call the already but not yet. We are here in the midst of a place where we cannot celebrate Advent and Christmas as we would like to, where we must wear masks and make sacrifices, where people experience illness and death. And yet, in the midst of this world, in all of its chaos and difficulties, we are already aware of the presence of the risen Christ in our lives. But we also know that the complete inbreaking of God into the world, the full reality of abundant life for all people, has not yet come to be. This already not yet world is not something that we can redeem or save, but it is something that is already and at the same time will be redeemed by God. Somehow, amazingly, this all-powerful God of the universe chose to come to us as a person and give us work to do in the meantime. God chooses to work through and in us. This work that we do, this preparation for abundant life, is our stewardship. Just as the servants in the example given by Jesus must be good stewards, must care well for the household until the final return of the homeowner, we are called to be good stewards, to care well for all of creation as we anticipate the final return of Christ and the abundant life we are promised that he will bring. The author of the Gospel of Mark thought that Jesus' return was imminent, and so Jesus' words here to the disciples are depicted as having great urgency. Of course, as it became clear that Jesus' return would not be within the lifetime of the apostles, most of that urgency was lost over time. Unfortunately, with that loss of urgency, we have sometimes lost track of the importance of what we have been called to do. Advent refocuses us. We hear these urgent texts, and we are once again reminded of the importance of what God has called us to. We are once again reminded of why stewardship is not just something we do to make sure our church has a budget, but is vital to our calling as Christians. Amazingly, I think our present time has brought back some of that urgency. The changes we have been forced to make have forced us to become more creative with how we share God's love and message, which has made us think more about why we do what we do and why it's important. And the disparity between the state of our current world and the abundant life we are promised has brought back the urgent feeling of the apostles. We have to do something to make this better and bring about change. We cannot keep living like this in a world where the situation changes every day and we are overwhelmed with bad news and therefore anxiety and worry about what might happen tomorrow. Advent reminds us to hold both our zeal for change and our waiting for God in balance. We know that not only the whole world, but even the sinfulness within our own lives is impossible for us to redeem on our own. But we do not fall into despair because the risen Christ redeems us and calls us anew each day into our task of faithful stewardship. Because we know that we cannot change all things on our own, and because we trust that God is ultimately in control, we can faithfully commit to our part, the thing that God, in our own time and context, has called us to do well, rather than become overwhelmed with things that feel impossible for us to accomplish. We are not the ones darkening the sun and moon, and we cannot pretend to try or even understand how that might happen. Instead, our stewardship, our bringing about of abundant life in anticipation of God's action, takes the form of an active waiting. Each of us doing what we are called to do, something we have gotten very good at during this past year. We cannot bring about the end of the pandemic, but we can wear masks, cease gatherings of large groups, and work to make sure families have what they need for their physical and spiritual needs during this trying time. Certainly, our pledge cards are an important part of each of us doing what we are called to. We need to have an accurate accounting of our resources in order to be the best stewards that we can be, in order to do our collective ministries well. But when we think of the amazing scope of God's plan, we cannot limit our idea of stewardship to simply that one action. Everything that we do as a church and as individuals to further God's plan for the world, to bring about abundant life, is part of our stewardship. None of this is done out of fear for what might happen to us whenever the Son of Man comes in the clouds, but instead as a response to the amazing fact that the same God who darkens the sun and moon comes to be present with us in our daily lives in countless ways. We live lives of stewardship as we both prepare for and respond to these moments of God's presence in our lives, which is truly what Advent in this season of waiting and preparation is all about. Amen.